Are you a neurodivergent individual or caregiver that's currently feeling lost and overwhelmed by the prospect of recovery from an eating disorder? Well, then you are in the right place, and I am so excited to tell you about my upcoming Autistically ED free group coaching program. In this program, you will gain insights and practical strategies to support yourself or a loved one through the tough recovery process, including exclusive information on how to partner with neurodivergent strengths so they can be utilized as a powerful tool in eating disorder recovery rather than a hindrance. Not only will this program include live coaching calls with me and other superhero supporters of autistic people with eating disorders, but you'll also have 24/7 access to a private community which is not on Facebook because let's be honest, social media can get so distracting, and receive custom created resources and handouts to maximize your understanding and ability to support yourself or someone you love with autism and an eating disorder. As I create this program, I want to continually ensure it's curated to you and your specific needs, so your input is highly valuable. Get on the waitlist and share your experience by filling in your details at livelabelfree.com/group. That's livelabelfree.com/group. And now, let's get back to today's episode.
Gotta put one foot in front of the other, and you'll be around the corner soon.
Welcome to Live Label Free, the podcast, where you'll learn to let go of limiting labels and embrace your unique brain. As my mom says so beautifully in her song,
Fear is a heavy load to carry.
which is why on this podcast, you'll learn the scientific links between neurodiversity and eating disorders, giving you a deeper understanding of how you can face your fears and become truly free. Together, you and me, we will keep putting
One foot in front of the other.
Hello, and welcome back to the Live Label Free podcast. I'm your host, Livia Sarah, and today I'm speaking to Dr. Neff, a neurodivergent psychologist and founder of Neurodivergent Insights, where she creates education and wellness resources for neurodivergent adults. Dr. Neff is the author of the book Self-Care for Autistic People, and she has published in several peer-reviewed journals. Passionate about distilling complex research into visually accessible formats, she translates research into visual pixels, which you can find on her website, Instagram, and digital workbooks. Beyond her visual endeavors, Dr. Neff co-hosts the Divergent Conversations podcast and spearheads a vibrant learning community tailored for neurodivergent adults. Welcome, Dr. Neff. I like to start off with this question today. What has been the most exciting thing about your day today?
Oh my goodness. Do you know me? I live a very boring life. So on Tuesdays, I often host community calls for my community, my learning community. And this month we were debriefing. We often do like wellness sprints that are month-long learning, and this one was on sensory regulation. So I hosted the debrief conversation, and I always really like those. I just like gathering with other neurodivergent humans and hearing people's insights. So I would say it was energizing and led to some interesting ideas. So that would be the most interesting thing about my day.
Well, that doesn't sound boring at all. That sounds very insightful, neurodivergently insightful. But yeah, I'm so excited to have you on today. Really excited to dive into, what it was like growing up undiagnosed autistic, when you did finally discover you were neurodivergent, and also what it's like being a parent of more neurodivergent beings. So I would like to start off with, last time when I was on your podcast, I know that we talked about the power of storytelling a bit, and how through stories we can share messages that are very valuable to other people without necessarily like trying to paint a picture in there. So with that being said, I'd like to kind of dive into your story growing up. Can you kind of provide a summary of what your life has been like? And then from there, we can kind of take some pathways into specific topics.
I love that. We can diverge from there.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I like that question. It's interesting when I go on podcasts or I share about my story, I often start in adulthood, kind of when I came to Discovery, but I really
Yeah.
like this invitation to revisit my childhood. And I'll give all the content warnings because I had, a hard childhood
Yeah.
in regards to my mental health. On one hand, I had a very supportive family, which I think buffered me from a lot of the trauma we see undiagnosed autistic people experience. But yeah, I started having mental health issues from a pretty young age. Like I remember kind of having pretty extreme depressive episodes as young
Mhm.
as 5. And then OCD started showing up around that age as well,
Mhm.
kind of 5, 6, 7, which now it's so interesting. Like now that I know all the research, when you're both ADHD and OCD tends to show up earlier. So I
Yeah.
had all of kind of the classic experiences. School was really hard for me.
Mhm.
I had some learning differences that, they tested for, and they were seeing some things, but it was kind of inconclusive.
Yeah.
But I now understand I have what's called surface level dyslexia. So things like reading
Mhm.
and writing were really hard for me. And so yeah, I kind of made it through elementary school, but it was around middle school, I think. And this
Mhm.
this kind of follows the trajectory of a lot of autistic girls where I started just noticing it felt like the gap between me and peers was growing. And it
Yeah.
was, I would see groups form and I would never fully understand why I wasn't in the groups. I kind of always felt like on the outside of them. I did a lot of things that created structure. So, like, I did a lot of sports and that created structure,
Yeah.
socializing. Something that came up on the podcast you were on Divergent
Uh-huh.
Conversations, I mentioned how I developed a lot of intense special interests that became part of my identity. So I grew up in the Bible Belt, the Midwest,
Mhm.
and I grew up evangelical. So religion became like the ultimate thing that my brain orbited.
Yeah.
And I got so into like the rules around religion. I
Uh-huh.
remember like telling people at school, like, don't say God's name in vain, don't swear. Like I was like the religion kind of police. That could probably be its own episode in and of itself.
Yeah.
But so I've always, and I even before I discovered I was autistic, it was like I feel like I'm always looking to some outside object to form my identity. So there was a lot of that in my early years, and a lot of that was formed through religion specifically. And then I had all the mental health things that a lot of us have. I had depression,
Yeah.
anxiety, self-harm, suicidality, and
Mhm.
it was confusing. Like I'd look back at my life and I would see like I have these really supportive parents, I have stability. Why am I struggling so much? And I'd feel a lot of guilt around like I have so much privilege and I'm so unhappy. And
Yeah.
that is part of what a later in life diagnosis really solved for me was a
Mhm.
mystery of kind of chronic mental health challenges all of a sudden made sense once I understood myself through this lens of autism and ADHD, which I, like a lot of parents, I discovered through my children
Yeah.
after they were identified. I feel like I'm rambling a bit, but that's a bit about kind of my upbringing was lots of mental health challenges, lots of using interests to create little spaces where I felt socially competent, and where I would attach my identity to. That was a lot of my kind of early life experiences.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing that. And first of all, you were not rambling at all. I mean, everything you're saying, I'm like, this could be another amazing autistic ADHD memoir. Because I know that Self-Care for Autistic People was more of a self-help book, and I know you do talk a bit about your own experiences. Specifically, I discovered the TENS unit for like was like the first time I was ever hearing about that, which I got a lot from. And yeah, I mean, you just share so many neurodivergent insights in that book. So for anyone listening, if you haven't read Self-Care for Autistic People, grab yourself a copy. But coming back to, you and your story and growing up, again, like as you're speaking, and I know we talked about this when I was on your podcast, when I spoke about my eating disorder and like latching onto that external identity and how health and fitness became a special interest and, just really not understanding why I was so different and latching onto these external things to have safety and have control in this unpredictable and uncontrollable world. I really just really appreciate you sharing that because it's such a common theme in neurodivergent people who are, I would say, like undiagnosed, but I also know people who, like, I work with a few younger clients that have now the autism diagnosis, and they're still like, I feel like there's something wrong with me. I feel like I have to be fixed. And I think I've noticed that a lot of that is from the parents not knowing what to do with this diagnosis and not understanding it. So you mentioned privilege and, growing up with really supportive parents and still feeling like you didn't fit in. I'm kind of curious if you can elaborate on that privilege guilt and on what you specifically mean about that.
There's so many ways my brain wants to take that. I mean, one, I always think it's important to explore and consider both our intersecting privileged identities and our intersecting marginalized identities
Mm-hmm.
just in autism space and autism conversation. So that's something that I just think is an important lens to have in general. With specifically with that, it was the feeling that my mental health and my like quality of life didn't match my external environment. Like it
Yeah.
didn't make sense. It didn't make
Yes.
sense why I was struggling so
Mm-hmm.
much.
Got it.
And that was the piece that led to so much confusion. And by the time I did come to understand my autism, I'd been in psychodynamic therapy for 4 years at that point because I
Mm-hmm.
was getting my doctorate in psychology at the time. So I was doing kind of depth psychological work.
Mm-hmm.
And I was exploring the possibility of like, do I have repressed trauma? Because my life doesn't make sense. And
Yeah.
the narrative a lot of mental health therapists have is like, well, if you have these clustering of experiences, it's probably trauma. So it was something I wasn't sold on that idea, but it was
Right.
something that I was curious about because
Mm-hmm.
again, there was this disconnect of why do I feel so alienated from my body? Why can't I get into my experience? Why is there this pervasive restlessness, this pervasive discontentment? Why these struggles with depression? And so it was the disconnect that was causing so much confusion and disorientation for me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so happy the direction you did take this in because as I was asking the question, I'm like, okay, this is so nuanced. I hope like it's not an overwhelming thing. And I think us autistic people, us neurodivergent people are so nuanced. Like when we think about anything, we don't look at it from a surface level. We like explore all these possibilities. And one of my younger clients actually said to me, she said, I really don't understand how people that are not autistic can even operate. And it made me laugh so because she was like, I mean, how can you even live with yourself if you're not thinking about everything? And I mean, she's 14. And I mean, it made me really emotional because when I first met her, it was like the spinning image of me. Like it was like me talking to me. And it was just crazy because it was in that moment talking to her that I so clearly saw and felt from like a futuristic perspective almost that alienation that I had felt at that age, but could not place anywhere. And you bring up trauma, which I think is I mean, there's a huge overlap between neurodivergence and trauma. And I've thought a lot about, why are neurodivergent people more likely, more susceptible to trauma? And I think as I've thought about it, of course, thought deeply about it, I've come to this conclusion that I believe that growing up, neurodivergent in a neuronormative society is in and of itself trauma. And I think all of these, manifestations that may overlap with trauma may be inherent neurodivergent traits just because of the nature of the society world we live in. What are your thoughts on that?
I have so many thoughts. So first of all, yes, trauma and autism specifically overlap at really high rates.
Mhm.
So on one hand, because we're autistic, there are things that make us more vulnerable to experiencing trauma. And so victimization, peer victimization.
Yeah.
On one hand, we're exposed, I don't love the like big T trauma, small T trauma, but like we're
Yeah.
exposed to those big T victimization traumas at higher rates.
Mhm.
We also are more likely to develop PTSD after a stressful experience. There's been
Mhm.
some really interesting research around this, partly the thinking being, we have these more sensitive nervous systems and
Yeah.
sensory systems. So the way we encode the memory, we are more prone to ruminate. And that ruminating over the event is part of what can also make someone more susceptible to developing PTSD. So in the classic sense,
Mhm.
we are just more vulnerable to both traumatic experiences and then to developing PTSD. Now, what you're talking about, that kind of low grade, chronic, like traumatic environment, language that I've learned this year that I really appreciate, and this comes out of the literature around complex trauma,
Mhm.
is the language of traumatic invalidation. So this is when we are chronically invalidated, and this could be like being told our perceptions aren't real. And again, thinking about this, we could just think about this from a sensory perspective for a moment. If someone says the food is too spicy or it's too bright, and if our parents say no, it's not, that's invalidation, because it's
Yes.
saying you can't trust your instinct there.
Yeah.
And or socializing, like we get so much invalidation of, we'll say things straight because we're straight shooters, and then someone, their response, which is more of that like hidden meaning, there might be a lot of social invalidation that happens.
Yeah.
And when you're in an environment, like when you're in a cooking pot, I don't think that's the right metaphor, but like pressure cooker,
Yes.
of constantly being told your perceptions are wrong, we start to lose trust with ourselves.
Yes.
That is like traumatizing on an identity level, when we can't trust ourselves and we can't trust our perceptions. And so I really have appreciated this lens of traumatic invalidation, because I think that's a lot of what many of us have experienced. And then with that, we lose trust in ourselves. And then with that, we're actually more vulnerable to be victimized, because we don't trust our bodies, we don't trust our sense of self. And that puts us at really high risk of other things. So yes, I just did the autistic thing you're describing, where it's like there are so many layers to the autism trauma connection, but it's a very pervasive connection.
Yeah, no, I'm just listening to this full of awe and wonder because what was the term you used that you learned?
Traumatic invalidation. So Melanie Harned, in her book on treating trauma in dialectical behavior therapy, again, she's not specifically talking about neurodivergent people. She's talking about complex trauma, but she has a wheel in there that I really like that shows kind of the different aspects of this. So things that are in there are things like criticizing, being criticized. And again, this happens a lot to autistic and ADHD
Yeah.
children. And over time, the person starts to believe I'm bad.
Yes.
Emotional neglect. And over time, the person might begin to believe I'm unlovable. This, I think, happens again a lot to neurodivergent children, not necessarily because even when the parents aren't neglectful, but because our needs are understood, right? So if
Yeah.
a child's like, it's too loud in here, I have to leave, like I have to leave the mall. And the parent's like, no, we're just going to push through. Like
Yeah.
this, our needs be neglected because they're not understood. That's something that happens to us a lot. Ignoring, we know that happens a lot with peers, but that's simply when people aren't paying attention to us. Misinterpreting, when our actions are misinterpreted. This happens all the time to us. I feel like I don't even have to unpack that because of that cross neurotype interaction.
Yeah.
Our actions get misinterpreted, our words get misinterpreted. When our reality is denied, this is another aspect of it. And again, this is if our perceptions are if they're different from our parental perceptions or the teacher's perceptions, we often get told our perceptions are inaccurate.
Yeah.
And over time we can start to believe like I am crazy or I am not to be
Yes.
trusted. The other ones are controlling, like so being controlled, and we start to develop this core belief I'm incompetent, blaming, excluding, and unequal treatment. Those are the others. So this kind of makes up the wheel of
Oh,
traumatic invalidation, the different domains that this can take place. And it's often from people, in our like it comes from parents, it comes from teachers. And the part that I like to emphasize, especially for neurodivergent children, this often isn't because parents are intentionally being neglectful. It's
right.
because they don't understand. Like when I think back about my children's early years, I'm guilty of some of this stuff. I'm guilty
Hmm.
of saying it's not too spicy. It's not too bright in here. It's not too
Yeah.
loud. Like I did some of this invalidation of my child and I grieve that. And I know that this happens not out of malicious, but out of not enough understanding, awareness, and education.
Exactly. And I think that's why it's so important we're having this conversation right now, because I'm learning so much from you too. Like, I've never heard of this term traumatic invalidation. Now I want that graphic and just want to plaster it on my wall so I can, through osmosis, like ingrain it into me. Because as you're speaking, I'm like, wow, like this understanding, this knowledge, I can't even begin to imagine how helpful this can be to improving, eating disorder treatment outcomes for neurodivergent people as well, because that is a huge, huge problem with, treatment centers saying they're neurodiversity affirming, and then it's like, put your freaking money where your mouth is. Like, this is not what you're doing is actually traumatizing. And I talk about that in my book, and we talked about that in the episode, and you mentioned this word trust many times, and I love that you mentioned that word because I feel like trust and safety are at the core of, human needs, and especially when it comes to being neurodivergent. I feel like when we don't have that trust, that sense of safety, that's when our nervous system is like, we are not okay, we are not safe. And that invalidation, what also happens is when we don't trust ourselves because we've been conditioned by the external world that we can't trust ourselves because we've been invalidated, well, we start to invalidate ourselves as well. Yes, I mean, I even did this during my own eating disorder recovery. I was told, not because they were trying to be mean or neglectful, but by like treatment providers and by like my parents. Like, Livia, like, this is still a restrictive behavior. This is still the eating disorder. And I was like, I felt in my heart that it was something else. I didn't know it was autism at the time. But I was just like, okay, well, I mean, I don't know what it is, so they must be right. And in that sense, when I did engage in these like specific like stimming, like a way for me to regulate myself and my nervous system is a lot of movement. I'm always walking around or jumping or doing something. And like during eating disorder treatment, this was, labeled as like compulsive eating disorder movement behaviors. And I wouldn't fully recover until I stopped doing that. But the more I tried to suppress this like innate need to move, the more anxious I became. But I kept invalidating myself because I was like, no, 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 this is the eating disorder. Like, I need to like learn how to like rest. And that's where, discovering you're neurodivergent and not only allowing it to be, but like even embracing it and like leaning into your needs, when you realize how much like easier life becomes and how much more regulated you can be, that is, where diagnoses do make a huge difference. And it doesn't, of course, undo the trauma, but I think it allows you to be a lot more gentle and forgiving in yourself and in others in how you've been treated by others and by yourself of like, okay, my parents were just doing the best they could with the knowledge they had. I was doing the best I could with the knowledge I had. And, continuing to realize like humans are constantly growing and evolving and we are lifelong learners. And I think when we can open ourselves up to that and to stop blaming and being angry about the past and instead say, I'm a continuous learner. I'm not wrong. I'm just learning. Again, I feel like it just makes life 1% easier.
I'm getting
Yeah.
so, I'm getting so excited by so many things you just said, and my brain's like going, of course, a million directions. I love that you bring up the topic of invalidating ourselves. This actually, I started by talking about the wellness sensory sprint we just did in our community, and this came up a lot around our sensory needs. And I talk about this when I talk about traumatic invalidation, is that the most dangerous kind is the self-invalidation that we learn to do, that we learn that I can't trust my body's perceptions because of the feedback we're getting. And that is what that creates a sort of kind of shattered sense of self when we can't trust the self, but it also puts us so at risk of victimization because we've learned to override my instincts around safety and what I need. And I've learned to prioritize the feedback I'm getting from others. And that puts us in such a vulnerable position, both socially, but also in regards to mental health. And I think you've absolutely nailed it on the head that what a diagnosis often does. And again, it's easy for me as someone who was diagnosed at 37 to kind of over glamorize diagnosis, because I see what you're seeing where you're like, well, I work with 14-year-olds and they're not having this big aha moment.
Right.
So I'm realizing, for me, I'll say, and for many of the adults I work with, I see this, what that diagnosis does is it gives us permission to validate our experiences as real. And once we have that, that is the foundation that like we can't, we're pretty limited in what we can do in our healing until we can trust ourselves. And so that shift from like, oh, I can trust my experience, I can validate my experience, I can stop invalidating my needs, is so profound. And I think any sort of healing, any sort of treatment really needs that at a foundational level. Yeah. I had other rabbit trail thoughts, but I'll pause there.
Yeah, no, 100% on the trust being the foundation of really anything. And this self-invalidation, you're saying like, yeah, once we give ourselves the permission, like I can trust myself. For everyone listening, I've given myself that permission. Megan, you've given yourself that permission, but it's not like, we don't still have moments where we question ourselves. And that word.
You mean it's not all or nothing?
Yeah, and I mean that I often like hear, I don't know if this is an autistic thing, but sometimes when people are speaking, there's like one word someone will use, and I'm like, okay, like I have that word in my hand right now, and I want to bring it up. You said that word override, and I want to like go into a rabbit hole there in the sense of like, in my personal experience, I do trust myself and I'm learning and I'm open to that journey. And a lot of the time, I try to like override these boundaries that I know I have in myself, which I guess could be like a form of not invalidating, but like just like stretching myself too thin and like knowing and being actively aware that I'm stretching myself too thin. But I feel over time and time again, like I can override this just for now. And the reason I bring this up is because I want to kind of shift into, what it's like being a neurodivergent business owner, because for me, something that I've noticed in my own life, which has been really interesting, is that I do tend to like put all or nothing, like basically my whole existence, I throw it onto some aspect of my life. When I was a teenager, it was my eating disorder, and now it's like my work, it's like my writing, my coaching, my content. Like I don't know who I am. I don't know what my identity is if I'm not doing live label free. And in a lot of times, when I'm tired, when I'm like, okay, if we don't stop, I'm going to go back into burnout. Those moments are really hard because I'm like, I don't know who my sense of self is. And I notice I will override those energetic boundaries to almost like maintain that identity that I've basically created. And I know that you talk about burnout a lot with Patrick on your podcast, which is some of my favorite episodes because they're just so like raw and honest. And I don't know if I heard correctly, but that you got a new deal, or that you were being put under
Yeah,
pressure.
I'm working on a book on burnout right now.
Yeah.
Yes. So burnout, I relate so much to what you're saying. Again, back to that idea of like, and it's so fascinating to have been exploring this in therapy before the autism lens of like, I just feel like I always need to be orbiting an object, or else I feel like the imagery that comes to my head is like being an astronaut in outer space that's like gotten disconnected and is just floating. And when I don't have a special interest to orbit, I feel like I'm free floating. This is partly why when I did like deconstruct, deconvert, whatever language you want to use, like I'm no longer religious. When I stopped being a Christian, it was really hard for me because I mean, and I think anyone who is raised fundamentalist and then stops being religious, there's a process around that. But for me, it was also like I feel orbitless for 15 years in my life. Like I went to seminary, I like wrote books in the Christian world, like I was orbiting this hardcore. And so those first few years afterwards, it was really disorienting to not have, like, I didn't feel like a self. So first, I just love what you're saying around there. Like, it feels like there always has to be something for you to orbit. Otherwise, it's like deflate is a word I've used a lot. Like I feel deflated if I don't have something.
And what's coming up for me is I love that astronaut. I'm just literally visualizing you in a little astronaut outfit, just floating around through space, orbiting around just religious planets. But that feeling of trapped, that I'm like you almost completely trapped in your astronaut suit without anything to orbit when there's nothing to orbit. And I know you've talked about that sense of feeling trapped. You talked about it in the beginning of your book. That's where I remember it. And I just remember so deeply resonating with that. And when we are not orbiting something, when we're not mentally transcending into this alternate universe of our special interest, we're like, oh my gosh, I'm in a body. Like, I can't be in this body. This feels wrong. And we want to escape that. And obviously, because we cannot physically escape our own bodies, we mentally escape them. We escape them through taking on these external identities, which ultimately are just stories we mentally tell ourselves. So, yeah, I'm curious if you have anything to say on that sensation of feeling trapped and kind of how you navigate that. Have you read my book, Rainbow Girl, yet? If you're a longtime listener of the podcast, you've probably heard me mention my memoir before, but in case you haven't, let me tell you about it. Rainbow Girl, a memoir of autism and anorexia, takes you on my very personal and vulnerable journey of growing up undiagnosed autistic, how this led to the development of an eating disorder, and the steps I took to fully recover and turn my mess into my message. And while I could do the very autistic thing and go into several details of the book, I figured it would be way more valuable to read one of the reviews. Here's what Mireille in the Netherlands has to say. In a world that's only scratching the surface of the autistic experience with anorexia, Livia paints a candid picture of how she went against all odds to overcome her eating disorder and transform fear into strength. A must-read for anyone in this situation, or helping someone in this situation, as is all her other online content. As a mother to a recently diagnosed autistic teenager with anorexia, this book gives me so much hope. To any medical professionals out there, please read this to gain immensely valuable insight into this complex interchange between these two conditions, so better help can be provided in the future. And now back to me. If you've already read Rainbow Girl and enjoyed the book, could you do me a 2-minute favor and leave a positive rating and review for the book on Amazon and Goodreads? It helps other people to find and read my story of lived experience, so that together we can bring more awareness and compassion to this prevalent yet misunderstood connection. If you haven't yet read the book, grab your copy of either the ebook, paperback, or audiobook of Rainbow Girl today by visiting the link livelabelfree.com/Rainbow Girl. So again, that's livelabelfree.com/Rainbow Girl. Now, let's get back to today's episode.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. That is what is part of what's so hard about burnout for me, or depression, is that those are the moments I lose access to my interest. And when I lose access to my interest and my curiosity, that is when I feel, and it's interesting, the word I've often used is collapsed. Like it feels even more than trapped. Like I feel like I have collapsed as a self. And it is, I mean, it's so painful because it's both like I don't have an escape and I feel like I don't have a self in those seasons.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So those like when my it is interesting. Like sometimes my mind is a very hard place to be, especially when my OCD is heightened. But
Hmm.
on other times, like my mind, when I lose access to my mind, and by that I mean like my curiosity and my
Yeah.
interest, like it's not a pretty picture. Because I
Yeah.
do exactly what you're saying. Like I use it so much to I I almost don't want to use the word escape. I know there is an element of escaping my body, but it doesn't always feel like escape it because it feels like I'm moving toward things that matter to me. But when I do know
Yes.
that when I lose access to that, it doesn't turn out well.
Right. No, and I understand what you're saying about that word escape. I think the more appropriate word that I've used before is transcend. Like, you're
I
not
like that.
leaving your body, you're just temporarily like stepping into a different element of yourself, almost like
Hmm.
yourself has like layers.
Well,
And
and
like,
also
yeah,
beyond the self. Like,
yes,
and that's what transcendence is. And like,
right,
positive psychology talks about this a lot, transcendence and awe, is that we often do best when we're tapped into things that are bigger than us. And I could see that being
right,
particularly true for autistic people.
totally.
Um, and so I do agree. Like, it's those transcendent moments when I am reminded it is so much bigger than me. And I feel like I'm tapped into that. There
Yes.
is meaning in that, there's power in that, and there is awe in that, which are really powerful experiences.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think that's for me one of the reasons why I am so passionate about this work and why you are so passionate about this work is because we know, like on a more than conscious level, like in our entire being, we feel that we are impacting, that we are contributing to the world far beyond us and probably far beyond our time when our physical being isn't even here anymore. Like, I know that so many autistic people in the past, like the gifts we have in our world now are thanks to past autistic people. And I just can see and feel you and me being like those next generations of like legacy leavers. And just that thought makes me so excited, that I am going to like leave my footprint in the world with something positive, with something good because there is so much that's not good in the world, right? And so to kind of not counteract that, but to kind of soften that, I feel like that is just part of my purpose on this planet. So yeah, speaking of next generations and all that, can you kind of share what it what it was like, I guess, first of all, because you mentioned you didn't know you were neurodivergent until your kid was diagnosed. 'Cause how many kids do you have?
I have two.
Two. Okay. So how was that, first of all, raising two children without one or two children without knowing they were neurodivergent, and then when they did get diagnosed, and then you eventually got diagnosed, how did the family dynamics change?
Oh my gosh, so much. So, first of all, it was really hard. Like, I had hard pregnancies. I didn't like being pregnant, which I then had guilt about because,
Hmm.
they're supposed to like being pregnant and all these
Yeah.
things. And I remember, like, especially being a younger mom and looking around and just wondering, like, how is this so much easier for other parents?
Hmm.
Especially the early years were really hard. I was chronically sensory dysregulated. I was a stay-at-home mom, again, probably because I felt like I should be, but it was looking back, it's like that was not a good fit in regards to just like even sensory. Like there were so many clashing sensory needs. One of my kids is really sensory avoidant, one sensory seeking. So we'd have so many sensory clashes that we didn't have a
Uh-huh.
framework for. So once we learned this, and at the time we discovered it, kids were 7 and 10 or 8 and 11 around that age. And I mean, so much has changed. We had so many aha moments. We've developed so much language that's helpful. I think the most helpful language, and I talk about this a lot, but the language of clashing sensory needs to be
Yeah.
able to actually talk about, like, okay, we're trying to watch a family movie. One of you needs to move your body. For the other one, like that sound is really hard. Like, how are we going to navigate this? And yeah, so much that used to lead to power struggles, since we now have a sensory lens to talk about, like, what are the needs here? Like,
Yeah.
what are the conflicts here? Not because two people are being like having a conflict, but their needs are in conflict.
Right.
that has just led to a much more peaceful home. It's also, I think, between my spouse and I am in a like kind of traditional het cis partnership.
Mm-hmm.
And so things that used to be coded for like, of course, the mom takes the kid to the birthday party. Like
Yeah.
now my spouse does a lot of the things that typically the woman or the mom in the relationship
Right.
does. And so we've also like reshuffled kind of our gender roles in the family.
Uh-huh.
Like I'm the primary breadwinner at the moment, and they're the stay-at-home like primary parent.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's been like basically everything's changed.
Yeah, no, and as you're talking about, the traditional relationship and you being the breadwinner and your spouse being the stay-at-home parent, I'm thinking a lot of my own parents, because as you read, my mom was the breadwinner, and my dad, who we only discovered was autistic and ADHD after my own discovery. And then my mom has a lot of guilt around that, feeling like she would have been more accommodating of his needs if she had known. Because I remember so many times my mom loves to play piano and do musical stuff, but my dad could not take that. So he would get angry and he'd say, please, can you save this for when another time, or can you go to a studio and do this? And she would be like, it's my house. I can do what I want. Like, this house is here because of my money. And that would be the arguments. And now looking back, she has so much guilt because she's like, that was so mean of me. Like, he wasn't making it up. Like, he actually was overstimulated. And in that sense, I feel kind of bad. But again, I was just a kid. And I think for me, like, that trauma in a sense was like, okay, I need to like escape slash transcend into this identity of an eating disorder. That was a way for me to like shut out that stimulation in a way and control what I did. And that was basically limit my stimulation in terms of food and sensory inputs. So in that sense, I was very sensory avoidant in terms of food as a child, but now I'm very sensory seeking. Like when it comes to food, I need a lot of sensory input, and I know that for a lot of, well, I don't want to say a lot of autistic people because everyone's so different, but specifically like clients with ARFID that I work with, when they are burnt out, when they're overwhelmed, like they need like bland foods. Like their safe food is like bland, pureed, like baby food, like nothing else will go into me. And it's funny because I'm the complete opposite. Like when I'm burnt out, I crave all the sensory input almost to like escape in that sense because I'm like, I don't want to feel like trapped in my body right now. So I'm gonna like go crunch on stuff so I can just be immersed in that sensory experience. So yeah, I just want to share that because I think it just illustrates again, how divergent the neurodivergent experience really is. And speaking of ARFID and children, you mentioned that your oldest has ARFID before we started recording. Can you kind of elaborate on what it's like being a parent of a child who does have really specific food preferences and how you create a neurodiversity affirming environment also from your own lived experience?
hmm This is where I feel really thankful that we developed a sensory lens when we did. And by sensory lens, I just mean like the ability to kind of like look at things through the filter of sensory experiences. So
Hmm.
even before I learned what ARFID was, like we were already adapting for the
Yeah.
sensory needs of our children. And again, my spouse who like has in the last year or two become kind of the primary parent. And partly, so first of all, I realize there's privilege in that, but partly it wasn't working for us to have two working parents. And I think a
Yeah.
lot of that comes up in some of the conversations with neurodivergent parents I work with is people don't realize the economic impact of often when you're
Right.
supporting complex needs, like it
Yeah.
doesn't work to have two working parents. And then there's of course
Yeah.
single parent households who are I have so much empathy for. Like it's just there's a lot you hold when you're okay, that was aside. But one thing that he has said that I find funny is like it feels like a full-time job to keep everyone in this family fed. Um, and it's and
Yeah.
he does an amazing job with it, but it's true. It's like, so one of my kids is vegan and and partly that's that like high sensitivity, moral sense, like justice sensitivity.
Yeah.
And then we've got gluten sensitivities, then we've got sensory stuff. So we have a lot of different food needs. And my spouse, thankfully, does enjoy cooking, but also spends a lot of time figuring out what people can eat.
Yeah.
So, first of all, just like huge props to him because left to my own devices, it would probably look very different. That said, having a sensory lens really was helpful because I think I just intuitively knew, okay, when my child's sensory demands increase, what they can take in on a sensory level is going to be a lot less. And
Hmm.
so I understood, like, okay, there's a transition back to in-person school. Okay, they're really struggling to eat beyond these two or three foods. I understand. Like, I just intuitively understood that. And I
Yeah.
think someone with pretty high sensory sensitivities, I can appreciate that. And so I think a lot of what it is figuring out what is tolerable, creating safety around that, and then having some explicit conversations around like, okay, these are safe foods, these are stretch foods. Does it feel like we can tolerate a stretch food today? No,
Hmm.
okay. But
Yeah.
like keeping the conversation going around that and always keeping the agency kind of located in my children around that. And then also just there's a lot of things that feel really normal for us, but might not be normal for families. Like we never demand a family meal.
Hmm.
Again, eating around other people is a very high sensory experience.
Yeah.
So anything we can do to reduce the sensory input around eating is something we do. We also realize that eating in high sensory environments like school is probably not going to happen much. So like how to
Yeah.
offset that. So yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of creative problem solving that goes into essentially how do we get this child enough calories. I'm sure we could be doing a better job around the nutrients, but
Hmm.
that's a whole like at some points and at some seasons, it's about getting enough calories. And then I'm kind of thinking like Maslow's hierarchy of needs and food needs. Then we can think about the nutrition supplements on top of that.
I love that you bring that up of, sometimes it's more important to make sure they're getting enough calories than that they're eating all their fruits and veggies because I think especially as someone, who works, I hope you didn't hear that, who works in that eating disorder space, there's so much pressure, there needs to be variety, variety, variety. But when someone is autistic and they're already struggling with food and have been struggling with food for as long as possible, the very idea of just eating more in and of itself, like even if it's like not even high volume, like they're drinking Ensure shakes or something and they're getting all their calories that way, like physically, the changing body, the weight gain, like even going through puberty, it can be so overstimulating and overwhelming that then this extra layer of, okay, well, today we're gonna have this for dinner, tomorrow you're gonna have that, and then we're gonna have this new texture thing. It's like, I don't want any of this. And that's what causes us to spiral into collapse and shutdown. And like, I can't handle anything right now. And it's so, so important of what you said, keeping the conversation, keeping the safety, keeping the agency, and also that word demand you used. For me, as someone who had an eating disorder with demand avoidance, like that combination is not helpful for anyone. So really, it is about, if you are having a child or working with anyone who does have difficulty with food, um, invite curiosity. Like, what can you handle today? What do you want to be able to handle? What can we do to accommodate that? But keeping that curiosity, and I think always, questioning where your judgments around what is quote unquote normal, where that is coming from. Because a lot of the time, it's an arbitrary rule or standard that we don't even know where it came from, right? Like the fact that like you have to eat in Holland, they're so anal about this, but like when an American comes to Holland and we're eating with our fork in the right hand, the Dutch people will say, "Oh, well, that's definitely someone that's not from Europe. Otherwise, they would be having the fork in their left hand. And like even these kind of like I was always the kind of person that was like at the Asian restaurants, I'm like, no chopsticks for me, give me a fork. And my family would be like, Livia, come on, like we're in an Asian restaurant. And I couldn't care less because I'm like, I cannot even eat this food if I'm eating with chopsticks. And again, it's like it's so what's quote unquote normal is so dependent on the culture. Like, because here in America, like if you go to McDonald's and they say, here's your hamburger with chopsticks, it's like, what? What? Like
Mhm.
this is not normal. So again, that judgments and labels and all of that and what's quote unquote normal really what even is normal, first of all, for anyone.
Mhm.
And second of all, I think it requires extra curiosity about what is quote unquote normal when we're speaking in the context of neurodivergence, because by
Totally.
definition, nothing we're going to be doing is from an subjective perspective, an outside external perspective is going to even be normal. So if we're not normal
Absolutely.
anyways, like we might as well go with
Embrace
that
it.
flow.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, and I love that because a lot of what you're saying is about taking the pressure off. And I think
Yeah.
with ARFID, that's huge. Like,
Yeah.
so judgment, pressure, anxiety, like the goal. And I'm so thankful. Again, I think just because I had a sensory lens even before understanding ARFID, I knew
Hmm.
we just need to decrease the anxiety around food.
Yeah.
So anything we can do to decrease anxiety and pressure and increase agency around food. And that's really been our approach. And I think that has made a really big difference. And so we don't have power struggles around food. But again, also part of that is because I have a spouse who spends a lot of time preparing food. And the other way this can look, and this is where I'm really glad it's not me preparing the food because that's a really big executive functioning lift for me to prepare food.
Yeah.
If you make so like there's if you have a breakfast sandwich that your kid typically
Hmm.
eats every morning, some days they might just eat a bite of it and that's all they can eat. And then not getting upset about the fact that you went to the effort to make this thing and they
Hmm.
only had a bite. And I think that's that hidden pressure that we're maybe not always thinking of. Like, of course, it's going to be kind of annoying if it's like, I just spent 20 minutes making you a breakfast and like a sandwich and you had a bite of it.
Yeah.
Um, but that, because autistic people pick up emotional tone so easily, that can feel like pressure of like, oh, I let down my parent. They made me this nice thing. I had a bite. So even
Yeah.
those hidden pressures, I think, are important to pay attention to.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm immediately thinking of when I was living in California, I called my mom, I think. And it was really hard to like get in touch because of the 9 hour time difference. And that's part of the reason I left California again. But now I want to go back. And she picked up and she was like, hello. And I was like, what's wrong? You can't talk. And she was like, no, 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 we can talk. It's fine. And so we're talking, but the whole time I'm like, nope, something's wrong. Like, and we were like 8,000 miles away. And then after 20 minutes, she goes, Livia, I really don't have time for this. I have to go like right now. And I'm like, you said there was nothing wrong. And just a random example, but I think that emotional undertone, even if it's on the phone and we are 8,000 miles away, autistic people are so sensitive. We pick up on everything.
Bringing it full circle, I mean, that's a great example of invalidation, right? In the allistic, non-autistic way, to say like that's fine, that even when it's not, that's actually pretty common. But we're picking up the emotional tone and we're like, oh, are you upset? Or this will happen a lot, like, are you upset with me? No, I'm not. But they are.
They
And so
are.
that's a classic, that's one of those invalidations that when that happens over and over and over, it's like, well, who do I not trust, myself or people?
I didn't even realize that. Okay, I love that you're bringing this full circle. I mean, everyone, this is the wonder of the autistic mind, the mind of a different kind. Okay, yeah, I'm just like, wow, like that's amazing. Okay, so I really am bad at like wrapping up podcasts. I'm like, I don't
I
want
am
you to
too. That's
feel
why I
like I
make
don't.
Patrick do it.
I'm like, I don't want her to feel like I don't want to talk to her anymore, but I also want to respect her time. So, that being said, is there anything else that you wanted to share with our listeners today?
Let's see. I mean, I have some random thoughts that have come. But is this like are you asking me like, should I share where people can find me? Is that what you're asking me? Or should I?
If there's not necessarily. I mean, like you can share that if you're ready for that, or if you're like, is there
No,
anything that
I
like
love this autistic
pressing?
communication. I was like, okay, are you doing the double meaning thing, or do I take you at face value for what you're asking? I did have a
Always face
fly.
value. Always.
Yes, I know. I shouldn't have even wondered. I did have a
Don't
flyaway
invalidate
thought.
yourself, Dr. Neff.
Um,
Oh wait, now I'm
I
placing a
s-
demand on you. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, no, but like seriously, is there anything else that you feel like you were hoping to cover today and you feel like we didn't that you wanna elaborate on? And then we can get to
um,
where we can find you later.
I came in with low, like little, very a lot of openness, so I didn't have many expectations of things I marked to say, but I did have a flyaway thought I wanted to circle back to because you know when you have a thought and then it like itches at you because it
Yes.
feels incomplete. I have an itchy thought. It was when you were talking, it was back to the traumatic invalidation conversation, and you said something about the importance of recognizing like our parents were doing the best with the information they had. We were doing the best with the information we had, and that the power of moving forward. This is one of the things of why I like this lens of traumatic invalidation so much. Something I'm seeing, and I'm seeing it more and more in autistic conversation, is what I would say is the misuse of the word gaslighting. So gaslighting is like, and I of course like precise definitions of things.
Yes.
Gaslighting is a manipulation tactic.
Mhm.
It is intentional. It is it is typically happening in where like there's control dynamics, unhealthy
Yeah.
control dynamics in a dynamic, and the intention is I'm going to cause this person to distrust their reality. So things like I'm going to make the light bulb less dim, and then when the person mentions it, I'm going to be like, no, it's not. It's your perception. Like it's a
Oh, that's
intentional
mean.
control.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's like I'm going to make this person feel like they are going crazy. And I don't use the word crazy like
Yes. No, no.
yes, but
Yeah.
like that is the experience I want this person to have. So I hear a lot of people saying things like, well, they're gaslighting me or they're medically gaslighting me or they're often I think what's happening is invalidation. And it's
Okay.
invalidation because there's a misunderstanding. It's not because the person is trying to control them. And I think that a lot of us would be able to find more repair in our relationships, but also heal from our past if we had a more accurate lens for like, yes, that's invalidating and that's hurtful and that's painful and that's something to heal from. But no, that person was not gaslighting me in the sense of they were not trying to control my subjectivity. So that's kind of a pet peeve of mine. And I
Yeah.
think that that's part of what makes this lens so powerful is it gives us a way to describe our experience of invalidation, but without accusing other people of abusing us
Mhm.
when that's not what's happening. Of course, sometimes that is what's happening, but this is a area where I think accurate language really matters.
Right. And obviously, as humans do, I'm now immediately like thinking about my own life experiences and my use of the word gaslighting, specifically medical gaslighting, when it came to eating disorder treatment while being autistic. And I'm like, yeah, that was invalidation, but I also think that was gaslighting. And like you said, it could be both. But like, for example, a psychologist or psychiatrist or whatever she was, telling a 15-year-old you're just gonna have to accept the fact that you're never going to get better from your eating disorder. Would that be like valid gaslighting?
So
Because like I don't think
so
she was trying
I
to like be mean, but like that's genuinely what she thought, I think.
I mean, I don't think, yeah, so I don't think that'd be gaslighting because it's not her trying to control and manipulate and cause you to distrust your perception. It is, first of all, an incredibly like, it's hard to imagine as a psychologist saying that to someone. It's a
Mhm.
very invalidating thing to say. It's a very demoralizing thing to say. And I
Mhm.
think our role is like typically to give people hope. So it is I would say like, a clinically harmful thing to say, an
Mhm.
invalidating thing, unless she was like, I want to manipulate Liv's perception into not being able to believe her own perception. It wouldn't technically be gaslighting as far as
Right.
like my
Right.
thinking of it, but definitely a harmful, like, Yeah. I don't
Yeah.
know. How
Yeah,
do you feel
I
about my
think I'm
response
just
to
no, I'm
that?
just like totally rethinking this term gaslighting now. Because it's funny because I always used the word invalidation before I even knew the term gaslighting existed. I mean, I only started hearing about this term gaslighting when I like really became submerged in the neurodivergent community, and it was
It's
like,
used a lot and it's
yeah,
used
because it was like
inaccurately, which is ironic because
that's
we like
why.
accurate.
Right, because it was like autistic gaslighting. Autistic gaslighting was I would have just used invalidation, but I think we've kind of then, so to hear, we've lost the true meaning of the word gaslighting because it's been overused. Just like when people say, I'm so OCD because I need to move that cup aside. It's like true OCD has lost its meaning because people just throw it around like it's an elastic band.
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay, but yeah, I have learned so much from this conversation. So thank you for sharing that. I'm so happy that I asked if there was anything else you wanted to share.
Well, it was
Um,
my itchy thought, so
yes,
thanks for
well,
hearing it.
itchy thought. I love that term. Itchy thought. Okay, mental note made, and now soon that's gonna itch at me. Okay, now, Dr. Neff, where can people find you? Where can you, yeah, now you can share all the links and all the resources. Face
Um,
value, we are providing this.
Always face value. I love that. So depends on how you like to take in information. If you're like an audio person, podcaster, then Divergent Conversations is the podcast that I co-host with Patrick. My website, neurodivergentinsights.com, has a lot of blog posts and infographics and just kind of wellness and education resources. And then I'm also on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, neurodivergent_insights. So those are the best places to find me.
Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing that like sensory preference, like audio versus visual, because I can be both. And I mean, I love listening to your podcast when I'm like going on a walk because I need like two forms of stimulation, obviously. And then your visuals and everything you create on your social media and on your website. I mean, again, I'm like when I look at it, I'm like only an autistic person could have created this. So
Oh,
yeah,
I
I
love
mean,
that.
yeah, amazing, amazing resources. Thank you for all that you do. Thank you for coming on and sharing your story and your insights. It's truly been a gift having you, and it's truly a gift to have you in this world. So thank you. Thank you everyone for listening, and I shall talk to you in the next episode. Bye bye for now.
Just one foot in front of the other, and you'll see around the corner soon.
This podcast has been recorded by your host, Liv. This podcast has been edited by my small but mighty Live Label Free team, and the beautiful song One Foot in Front of the Other that you are now listening to was written and recorded by my beautiful mom, Louise Alexandra. I am so grateful for my team and everyone who supports Live Label Free. Together, we are always stronger.